Hello, and welcome to our fourth week on the theme of LGBTQ plus inclusion for Awakened. I love 1 John 4 because in the scripture, the author writes that God is love, and that we are called to love because God has loved us, and that God calls us to incredible love, and that the way we experience God's presence in our lives is by loving others. And when we are acting in ways that are not loving, we are acting in ways that are counter to the will of God, because God's will is love. God is love. The author puts a finer point on it and says that if you haven't experienced love, you haven't experienced God. And how do you expect to love the God whom you can't see when you can't love the person who's sitting across from you? You know, actually, I think a lot of times people have an easier time loving the God whom they can't see because people frequently make God into their own image. Now, they'll deny it, but I think it's true. I love the Anne Lamott quote where she says, "You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people that you do." Because God calls us to love absolutely everyone, especially those who are the hardest to love. Now look, I'm not saying that we don't set boundaries, that we give everyone access to our lives. I'm not saying that. We absolutely set boundaries. But what I'm saying is that we are called to love, and by loving even those who are the hardest to love, we free ourselves from bitterness and resentment eating us up inside. So often we make being a Christian harder than it has to be, following Jesus harder than it has to be. When we wonder what to do in any situation, we love. That's what the Bible calls us to do. That's what Jesus calls us to do. Now, exactly what that looks like in every situation can get a little complicated, but if we wonder what to do, we love. I think that if more Christians really embraced the idea of agape love, agape in Greek, this self-sacrificing, unconditional love of neighbor, that if more Christians really embraced agape love, we'd be so much better off, and the issue of LGBTQ plus inclusion wouldn't be an issue at all, because we would be loving folks and welcoming them into the full life and leadership of the church. Unfortunately, too often, Christians proclaim a false love built on a true hate. And that true hate is based in fear. Fear of folks who have different life experiences than they do, folks who have a different set of values, folks who are living lives differently, or often fear of their own sexuality or gender identity. None of this should be an issue for Christians, because Christians call to love one another as God has first loved us. And it is through loving others, especially those in marginalized communities like the LGBTQ plus community, that we experience God's presence. During this section where we're talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, we're also reflecting on the quotes of LGBTQ plus leaders. This week's quote comes from Father Shannon Kearns, who is a trans priest. And the quote is, "If what it means to be righteous means being like them, I am not at all interested. I will claim my deviance with pride, because to me my deviance looks an awful lot like trying to follow Jesus." This week's spiritual practice is to reflect on that, to think about what it means, especially in conjunction with our call to love one another. As I reflect on that quote, it strikes me that being deviant from what is expected is also being Christ-like very often. Jesus so often subverted expectations, especially in the folks with whom he chose to keep company. That Jesus also often recognized that God's people were those who were living on the margins, and that the call of the Christian community was to lift up those who are oppressed and those who are marginalized. May it be so, and thanks be to God. Amen.